That's good.
Okay.
I'm so happy that Jakarta is doing so much better now.
Yeah.
When Malaysia needs to catch up.
It used to be the worst, but now I think is much better. Yeah.
Yeah, it helps, I think, because of all of our vaccination rates.
Yes.
Vaccination was quite fast, eh?
Mm.
Okay, I think we can start now. We already connect to the YouTube. We will just open this to all the attendants here. We'll just need to allow some time for them to log in. All right, I think we can start already because people still keep joining this webinar. But now we have 106, 107. So I think we can just continue. And we are also now live in the YouTube, our ASEAN YouTube channel. So we're okay. So anyway, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Rahmat Effendi from the External Economic Relations Divisions at the ASEAN Secretariat. I will guide throughout the sessions. So as you may be aware that this is our third webinar series for the Unlocking ASEAN for Business. And today we will focus on chapter 8 and 9, which are trade and services and temporary movement of natural person. This webinar is in collaboration with the East Asian Business Council, EABC, as our part of our effort to connecting business to the RCEP Agreement. And the special of the day is that we will learn how removal of restrictive and discriminatory measures affecting trade and service, covering all modes of supply and facilitation, temporary entry and temporary stay of natural person engaged in trade, supply of service or conduct investment, will better connect business and help create a stronger and integrated regional supply chain, and most importantly, contribute to our region's post-pandemic recovery effort. And for the first session today, it will consist of 4 presentations, which will focus on understanding the chapter itself, chapter 8 and 9 of the RCEP Agreement. And then we will go through how to navigate the Annex, schedule of specific commitment for services, and then also schedule of reservation and non-conforming measure for trade and investment. And then move on to Annex on telecommunications, and we also cover Annex on financial services and professional services. But before we begin, we would like to first give the screen to our keynote speaker. We will have Mr. Hak Hee-jo, is the AEBC chair for 2021, to deliver the opening remark. Over to you, Mr. Hak Hee-jo.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Hak Hee-jo, the Vice President for International Affairs of Korea International Trade Association. Concurrently, I'm also serving as the chair of the East Asia Business Council of 2021. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the ASEAN Secretariat for co-arranging this RCEP webinar of Unlocking RCEP for Business. I would also like to welcome the EABC members and the business people who are here with us today. The importance of RCEP stems from its sheer size, as it includes the economies of Asia and Oceania, which account for about 30% of the world's production, trade, and population. It is also the world's largest mega FTA that came to conclusion amid the spread of new protectionism and in the midst of the global economic slump due to the COVID-19. The RCEP agreement will bring tremendous business opportunities and create jobs for the people of the region, not only by facilitating trade and reducing tariffs, but also by injecting vitality into the global economy in times of growing uncertainty and protectionism around the globe. As for the service sector, it is expected that at least 65% of the service sectors will be fully opened with increased foreign shareholding limits, including professional services, telecommunication services, financial services, computer-related services, and the services related to distribution and the logistics. The efforts made by RCEP signatories to liberalize various service sectors will encourage more service suppliers who have seen market saturation in their home countries to reach out into overseas market as a result of regulatory changes. This will further result in greater trade connectivity and the integration of business operating within the 15 RCEP member countries. We still have many tasks ahead of us. I would like to emphasize that we must make endeavors to promote and introduce RCEP agreement to our business people so that they may take a full advantage of it. In this regard, I firmly believe that today's webinar is a timely occasion that will benefit the business community, the main stakeholders of the RCEP agreements when it comes into effect next year. Panel of trade experts, former RCEP negotiators, and speakers from the private sector will discuss the commitments and the future prospects of RCEP agreements, specifically of the service sector. I believe that everyone participating in this webinar will have an opportunity to broaden their understanding of the agreement and make better use of concrete and practical means to benefit from it. Before concluding my remarks, I'd like to welcome all the participants of this webinar and wish the best in all your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hakijo. Now we are all excited to listen to our key presenter, but first I would like to invite our speakers and panelists for a short photo opportunity. May I request speakers and panelists to open the camera? Okay, 1, 2, 3, RCEP. All right, thank you. Thank you. So for the attendees today, for just some house rules, all participant camera and microphone we have been disabled. So you, should you have any questions throughout the session, during the presentations and also the panel discussion later on, feel free to use the Q&A box, and we will be able to answer the questions after the panel discussions. So without further ado, may I now give the screen to our first excellent Ms. Wan Wadrina Wan Abdullah. She is the director at the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, Malaysia. Wadrina will walk us through and unlock the Chapter 8 and 9 of the RCEP Agreement. You may have the screen, Wadrina, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Effendi, and also thank you to Mr. Hakijo. I take note of your opening remarks. Then yes, RCEP indeed is a very important tool. It's been identified also under the ACRF as one of the tools that will help us out of this pandemic and also to ensure future resiliency regionally. So without further ado, I'll start unlocking these chapters as what Effendi had mentioned. So I hope the key is good enough for all of you to understand. So with that, I'll be talking, well, hopefully in a nutshell, with regards to the trade and services and movement of natural persons chapter. These are very, very important chapter. And as mentioned by Mr. Hakijo, it accounts services, trade and services accounts nearly 65% of trade within the region. So basically, I would like to actually mention a few objectives actually of this presentation so that, there'll be appreciation for the participants. I hope that, because this is a chapter that we've actually negotiated for 8 years. So it took a long time to actually come to the finishing line. So I don't expect everyone here to also within this short span of time to understand, but I hope that you could have a basic understanding on both these chapters, the trade and services and MMP. I also want to share with you also some of the challenges and the dynamics of the negotiations involving these chapters. And of course, lastly, I hope that, after listening, not only to my presentations, but the presentations by other speakers to be more motivated towards understanding and also learning about these chapters, because as you know, these chapters are all made publicly available. And I think at this point, I would also like to say that, why do governments enter into negotiations, free trade agreements? Well, it's basically to provide opportunity in a very secure and stable trading environment for all to trade. So it's up to the businesses in our industries to actually capitalize on the benefits that this FTA has to offer. As mentioned earlier by Mr. Hakijo, that this is the largest FTA in the world with accounting to 30% of world trade, 30% of world population. So that's a whole lot of market access to be actually capitalized by all the RCEP nations. Next slide, please. Next. So before I go on in trying to summarize both these chapters, I would just like to take this opportunity to actually share the ideology when we had negotiated both the trade and services and MMP chapter. It's basically my way of having an opportunity also to dispel all of the perceptions, that have been made and provided to us, after we had actually completed the negotiations and it was signed. So there was a lot of comparison being done with the CPTPP. At this point, I would like to say that I also had the benefit of actually being the lead negotiator for trade and services and MMP and CPTPP. So I'd like to take this opportunity to say that both RCEP and also the CPTPP is complementary. Now, why am I making this statement? Well, basically, it's because, during the course of negotiations, as you know, some of the ASEAN countries, in particular, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, and Brunei, were also part of the CPTPP. But also in RCEP, we have the other 6 ASEAN member states who are not members. So during the negotiations, there have been, ambition, CPTPP ambition being thrown into the negotiations. So everybody forgets. That's why I have ASEAN centrality right in the center. So whenever we do an ASEAN +1 FTA like RCEP, the core of the negotiations, the heart of the negotiations is always ASEAN centrality is always at the forefront. Even though you have 10 individual countries, but whatever it is, consensus has to be one and it must reflect ASEAN centrality. So hence, that's why for Malaysia, even though we've done the CPTPP, but we see it complements very well with RCEP. And having said that, I would also like to say that, the ambition of these two FTAs are also very different. The modalities that they have used is also different. Like, for example, if I may share here from my experience doing in the CPTPP negotiations, for a particular chapter where countries already have FTAs, in the CPTPP, negotiations will not take place, especially on the market access for goods, whereby in the CPTPP, market access for goods only took place between countries that did not have any existing FTAs. Now, in comparison to RCEP, all of us are involved in the market access negotiations. And having said this as well, we go on based on consensus in RCEP, whereby whatever we have agreed, everything is actually materialized. It is immortalized into the agreement. But if in comparison, if you were to look into the CPTPP, because the documents are made available, there are a number of side letters. So these side letters are part of the market access in the CPTPP, which if you were to compare to RCEP, does not exist. So hence, I would say in terms of the ambition, in terms of the level of commitment made in RCEP, it's different. So as you can see, I would say it is much more of a text-driven agreement, and everybody else, or I would say all RCEP parties, will benefit on the outcome that has been negotiated during the bilateral market access, both for goods, services, investment to all RCEP parties. And as you can see as well, ASEAN, we have come a long way to actually reach RCEP. So that's why, if you can see on the top there, I've put their building block approach. We had our first FTA, which was quite comprehensive, which is the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA. So we started from there. And if you look into the chapter, it's slightly different from what we have today in services under the RCEP. And that, if you can see as well, we always have anchored GATS as well as ASEAN Plus One agreements to actually develop the chapter for both services and MMP. And not only that, we've also taken into account that, you know, the only thing constant is change. So that's why in the RCEP, you can see there have been a lot of articles that have been modernized. And I dare say too that, you know, some of the articles under the trade and services and MMP are either derived from the CPTPP or even have almost the same level of ambition. Okay, so I hope that everybody can understand why the text is as it is. As you can see, because we have different level of development among the 10 ASEAN countries. So that's why during the negotiations, I think people, especially those who are not involved in the negotiations, you know, they always have this question, you know, why is it that you have some more advanced developing countries? Why do you have those that have high ambition bilateral FTAs, but why is this not reflected in RCEP? So I like to just say that at this juncture, we have 10 of us together, and with 10 of us, we have to have the same level of ambition. So that's why we take into account the level of development, you know, the readiness, as well as the sensitivities of all of us. And having said that, just imagine, okay, when we started, we had 16 countries. So as we went on, we had actually negotiated for over 8 years. So you can see how complex and how dynamic the negotiations are. Just imagine you have 16 countries with different economic level of development, different interests, different sensitivities. So that's why it took us longer compared to the TPP. We took about 5 years, but with RCEP, it took us about 8. So I hope that, you know, this is something that, you know, puts things into perspective. And I hope that this has also dispelled some of the perception out there between the ambition of RCEP compared to other modernized FTAs out there. So next, please. So with that, you know, I would just like to say that the trade and services that was negotiated under RCEP, like the other ASEAN Plus One FTA, is always intended to provide opportunities to our businesses, our investors, and also our services providers. So basically, you know, I hope that, you know, this could be appreciated by some of the participants, especially if you're involved with trade and services. The chapter is very important. Why? Because it provides you the rules of the games. It provides what you can do in terms of, you know, entering a market, what you cannot do. And also what is important is the promise given by all RCEP parties that you provide a secure and stable environment for services suppliers or services users from the RCEP countries. So basically, I'll just deep dive a little into the content and scope, as well as also I would like to point out that, you know, in trade and services, I think what is important is to know what are the rules. So there are two types of commitments, actually. One is the rules and the other is the market access commitment. So what do you mean by rules? So rules is basically, like I said earlier, it is what is allowed and what is not allowed. And also in the case where, you know, you have suffered a wrong or if there is some discrimination, the chapter also provides you a remedy. And as well, what is important also is the market access commitment. Now, the market access commitment here, I would like to highlight, since there are now 15 of the RCEP countries, there will be different types of commitments made by each of one of us. So it is important to see, you know, each and one of us, depending on the market that you're interested, and then it will actually provide you the information of, you know, what is allowed or what is not allowed, or how much equity would a RCEP country would be allowed to actually try in those sectors that they are interested. Okay, next, please. So basically, in summary, the Trade and Services chapter has 25 articles and 3 annex. Now, these 25 articles, the ones that I have actually highlighted in yellow, this is where we have actually improved it over and above the ASEAN +1 FTA as well as GATS. So we have the scope, the general rule, as well as obligation, transparency, commitment approach, which I will actually explain a little bit more, and the one professional services. So this is a new annex. It's in form of an annex. We have not had this before in any of our FTAs. And this is something that was actually, in a way, I dare say, emulated from what we have in the CPTPP as well. So this is one of the things that we have modernized our ASEAN +1 agreement, where we have it now in RCEP. So next slide, please. So in gist, I just like to highlight what are the plus or what are the improvements we have in the RCEP Trade and Services Agreement. If you can see in the first box, I've stated there positive list plus. I guess some of you, if you're not familiar with it, or if some of you are, well, positive list is the way how we make commitments for trade and services. It provides you the market environment in which a RCEP country is allowed to actually set up a business or also to do business in the sectors that the countries have committed under the market access commitment. Now, why is there a plus? It is a plus because this is the improvement that RCEP is providing compared to the other ASEAN +1 FTAs. If you were to look into the text, it provides that countries that provide market access in a positive list would also need to provide future liberalization, which means that, you know, in future, you would actually further improve the market access for selected sectors. And another element is also whether you can choose to have the transparency list, which provides you the information on how the sector is regulated, or you make commitments with regards to the MFN, which means that if any of the RCEP country provides market access conditions that are much better compared to the present RCEP countries, then that preferential MFN provided to the non-RCEP will have to be extended to the RCEP countries. But this one, mind you, you will have to look into the details of the scheduled commitments, because in the scheduled commitments, countries, RCEP countries who take this approach will have to indicate what are the sectors that will be subject to future liberalization and MFN. So this is important for everyone to actually look into the commitments and also be familiar with the document. Now, the second improvement in RCEP, which we do not have at all in our ASEAN +1 FTA, is actually the negative list approach. As I mentioned earlier, ASEAN always takes a building block approach. The first time that, you know, this concept of negative list approach was actually introduced during when we first started ANZ FTA, but at that point of time, ASEAN was not prepared. And I think the negative list approach basically was a foreign concept to all of us. But now in the RCEP, we have a dedicated article which provides an opportunity for countries that are prepared to do, like for example, Malaysia, when we concluded RCEP, we already had provided our negative list using the negative list format. And I would also like to highlight here that there is also a transition article, as you can see, the blue box, whereby those who had provided positive list commitments would actually need to transition to the negative list. So at the end of the day, the objective of the RCEP chapter is everybody has to move to the negative list. But of course, like I mentioned, we have different levels of development. Depending on the state of your economic development, you are given between 6 to 15 years to actually transition. So this, I think, is the most important element, I think, in the RCEP agreement, which makes it different from all the other trade and services agreement chapters that ASEAN has agreed in our ASEAN +1 FTAs. And also the other one is on auto MFN. This is also something new as well, that because previously we've always included only negotiated MFN. But for purposes of RCEP, as well as to modernize our FTAs, we have actually agreed to an article on auto MFN. And then we have also the enhanced domestic regulation. This is also an upgrade in comparison to the ones that we have agreed in our previous ASEAN +1 FTAs. And I would also dare say that this also has elements that were actually emulated from the CPTPP Trade and Services chapter. And we also have a new article that we would not have had in our previous ASEAN +1 FTA is a local presence. Now, local presence, this article in short is quite important, especially when COVID has taught us how important digitalization is, e-commerce is. So this is where basically local presence is an obligation, which actually says that, those that want to provide cross-border trade services will not be imposed the requirement of setting up a company in the host country. So I think this is quite important, especially during this COVID. It has taught us how much e-commerce is very important, especially to the MSMEs. Okay, next, please. So basically, this slide is just to give you a flavor of what I have mentioned in the previous slides. So these are the articles. If you want to actually learn more or read more, this is the articles that I've listed. So you could actually have a look into what is actually written in it. But basically, what I mentioned in the previous slide is what actually these articles are trying to actually provide. So I hope that, after this webinar, I do hope that, that I have triggered interest among some of the participants and that you would actually take the time to look into the agreements and also explore these articles. Okay, next, please. Okay, so now another important aspect of the trade and services is actually the market access commitments. So how are these market access commitments made? So next slide, please. So if you were to see, it is actually provided under a specific article, which is called Article 8.3. So in that article, if you were to deep dive into it, it actually provides the commitments, approaches to making commitments. And making commitments is the scheduling of the commitments. So as you can see, I have provided Article 8.7 and Article 8.8. So these are two different approaches to schedule the market access commitments. And as I have mentioned, countries like Malaysia, we have actually done our negative list, or it's also called as non-conforming measures, or NCM in short. So we had used Article 8.8 because Article 8.8 will also provide the list of things that a country needs to do if you are going to make your commitments using the negative list approach, or better known as the non-conforming measures. But if the country or some of us here in RCEP would what they have done, they have also done in the positive list. Now, normally countries that have this option to do the positive list is because it is something that, they would need time to actually do the negative list. But as I mentioned, the positive list commitment is a plus here in RCEP because there are other conditions attached when you do a positive list. And as I have mentioned, you have to actually indicate the sectors where it will be subjected to further liberalization. And you have to choose either doing the transparency list or committing to MFN. So these are the type of approaches that we have made commitments. Okay, next slide, please. So basically, this is just to give you a snapshot, when you look into the agreement, right? So when you look into the chapter, in particular, trade and services, when you do the positive list approach, so the related article, the corresponding article, is Article 8.7. But even looking at the slide here, you also have to take note that there are also related articles that you would also have to commit when you prepare your positive list commitments. So these are as stated here, national treatment and market access. So national treatment, I think this is the most important treatment that you can find in any of the trade and services chapter, because it is to ensure that treatment is given the same. Foreign or RCEP services providers are provided the same treatment as a local or domestic services supplier. And market access would provide you the conditions in which countries are allowed to impose on RCEP services providers if he or she would want to venture into the RCEP country market. And there's also additional commitments here. So this additional commitments here, optional, is an example that I could give you is like, for example, if you provide professional services examination made, done in English. So this one is something that, if countries do have it, they can actually make this a commitment. And this is also something that is also allowed if you also use the negative list approach, which I do, I have a separate slide. And as mentioned earlier, having identified if you're going to do the services market access using the positive list approach, there are additional commitments or conditions that you also have to take note of, which is the future liberalization. And as you can see, I've stated there, and it's either the MFN or the transparency list. Now, having said this, I do realize that, this will be ventured more detailed by Glenda, so I'll just leave it at here. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. And then on the next slide here, I just wanted to make the comparison between the positive and negative lists. We have the corresponding article of Article 8.8. So if you're going to do the negative list, you would need to go through that article and see what needs to be done. And not only that, the similarity in terms of the obligations imposed between doing both these approaches, like you've seen before the previous slide, is on national treatment, market access, and additional commitment. But there are two more obligations when you do the negative list. So this is something that, unlike the positive list approach, where you can choose between MFN or the transparency list, under the negative list, you need to include MFN and local presence. So that's why it is important to familiarize yourself with the commitments that a country makes. And if you were to look into the negative lists and positive lists, even the way commitments are made are slightly different. So I hope that, this would be further elaborated later by Glenda. Okay, next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, some of us have done positive and some of us have done negative. So those who have not done negative yet, they're given a period between it's actually 6 and 15 years, depending on the level of development of the country. So this is provided for under Article 8.12 on transition. So this will only kick in after we've actually entered into force, which we hope that, that RCEP will enter into force, by early next year. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so basically, earlier on, that was on trade and services. So I'll also quickly move on to MMP. Okay, so now MMP has been a very important chapter, and as you can see that, in a lot of FTAs, more and more countries are moving towards having, this MMP with, on a separate chapter. And likewise for RCEP, we've also, even in our ASEAN +1 FTAs, we do have, disciplines with regards to move of natural person. So basically, what does this mean to the business, to the industry? Well, it means that, having this movement natural person chapter would allow for businesses and investors, contract services suppliers to move around the RCEP region, which is facilitated, and hopefully it'll also be seamless. And especially now, when we have our borders closed, we hope that, later on when the pandemic has turned endemic and hopefully goes away, we hope that, this would also provide better opportunities for RCEP countries, especially for our talents and business people, investors, to go around ASEAN to build up their businesses, as well as also to build up talent and expertise. So next, please. So under this chapter, there's only 9 articles. And all these 9 articles are basically based on our previous ASEAN +1 FTAs, but it's also, some of them have been emulated, I would say, also by the CPTPP chapter as well. So I would say that, the MMP chapter that we've agreed in RCEP here, compared to all the other ASEAN +1 FTAs that have an MMP chapter, I would say it is much of an upgrade. And under the chapter 2, we also provide the scope meaning that what kind of categories of people or more for that will be allowed to utilize the commitments. And like the earlier Trade and Services chapter, the MMP chapter also is divided into the rules and market access commitments. Okay, next, please. Okay, this is just to give you a bird's eye view here. So these are the elements in the chapter. So like I mentioned, under the chapter, you have the schedule commitments and the rules commitments. So basically, in drawing up the commitments, what we do in trade and services for some of the services sector, we also have a schedule that provides or lists down all the categories that each member makes commitment. And again, I would like to highlight here, the commitments between all the RCEP parties differ. So that's why it is important to look into the schedule, especially for countries that any businesses or industries are actually interested. So in drawing up the schedule, I just like to highlight here, which I've already stated, the relevant articles. So it's Article 9.5, which is where it says that each member must actually provide the schedule, and the schedule commitment would actually indicate the type of subsectors or sectors or even the categories of businesses of persons, that would be allowed. So basically, this would actually provide each country would actually provide a secure and stable environment for businesses and investors to actually move around within the RCEP region. So here in the first time, if you can see there under Article 9.2, we have the scope, which is lists down the categories that we actually commit. And also there is another new article, Article 9.3, spouses. So this is something ASEAN has never agreed before in any of our ASEAN +1 FTAs. But I also like to highlight here because why is it optional? Because, during the course of negotiations, like I mentioned, there's 16 of us, different interests, different sensitivities, but some countries viewed that this was a very, very important category. So that's why the language is that countries that are prepared to provide this type of category as a commitment would do so. And those that have sensitivities would not be placed any obligations to do so. And then on the rules commitment, so basically this one is just to provide transparency as well as facilitation. And unlike some of the +1 FTAs, taking into account the sensitivities, when you talk about movement of natural persons as well as immigration procedures, of course, it's an issue of sovereign. While the dispute does not apply, but we've also emulated some of the language that was in CPTPP. If there is a trend or there is a recurring instance where the same thing happens, then this is somewhere where you could actually seek redress. So this is something different from what we have from the other MMP chapters in our ASEAN +1 FTAs. And as well, we also have an article on cooperation, which basically provides an avenue for RCEP members, to see whether there are areas with regards to facilitation of the movement that can be improved. So this in short is what the MMP chapter would entail. So with that, I think this is my last slide. So I hope that with this short presentation that I provided, that it had sparked some appreciation and also some interest in learning more what both these chapters have to offer. With that, thank you, and I give back the screen to Effendi.
Thank you so much, Madrina. Very comprehensive presentation. So we'll move on to the next speaker. The next speaker we have is Glenda Reyes. She's the head of monitoring, surveillance, and coordination at the ASEAN Secretariat. She will guide us on navigating the Annex 2 and Annex 3, and plus Annex on professional services. Glenda, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Glenda Reyes, and as Fendi or Ramat has mentioned, I am with the Monitoring, Surveillance, and Coordination Division of the ASEAN Integration Monitoring Directorate. But that may surprise you also, what am I doing here speaking about navigating Annexes 2 and 3 on Chapter 8 of the RCEP, specifically on trade and services. Just a bit of a background, I used to handle trade and services and have done some servicing of negotiations, FTA negotiations in my previous engagements with the ASEAN Secretariat, together with Rina and some other colleagues, including Lan and Datu Rabi. So that would explain why I'm here before you presenting the Annexes 2 and 3 of the RCEP agreement. Next slide, please. So basically, as already discussed with you by Rina, the topic that has been given to me is how to navigate the services, the schedules of commitments in the trade and services chapter. But before we go into the nitty-gritty of how to read or how to navigate the schedule of commitments in the RCEP agreement, or particularly in the trade and services chapter, let's just look at this slide. And this is just to give everyone an overview of what we are talking here when we talk of services sectors. Basically, when we talk of trade and services, we're actually talking of a number of wide area of trade and services sector. And you can just imagine, for example, transport sector, where you can actually subdivide it into rail transport, land transport, maritime transport, air transport, land transport, maritime transport, pipeline transport. And even when you talk of rail land transportation, you can even further subdivide it into rail transport and bus transportation. And that can even be subdivided into passenger and cargo transportation services. So basically, when we talk of services, we're covering all services sector. And in fact, in the WTO, they actually have a listing of services classification after the 4 digits, similar to trade and goods. You have like 4-digit, 6-digit level of categorization of the different services being provided by different service suppliers and providers. But while we are talking of all services sectors, as true with all other FTA agreements, there are exceptions, and these exceptions are actually negotiated by the parties among themselves. And in the case of RCEP, if I'm not mistaken, in paragraph 3 of the chapter of trade and services, there are a number of exceptions that are spelled out, which are actually exempted from the coverage or the scope of the FTA, or in particular of the trade and service agreement. If I'm not mistaken, one of these would include government procurement. There would also be exclusion of cabotage maritime transport, ground handling services, in air transport services, among others. So basically, when you look at services, while all of it are covered, there are exceptions, and you have to be mindful of what these exceptions are when you look at the schedule of commitments and the chapter on trade and services of the RCEP. Okay. Now, when we talk of the chapter, we're actually talking of trade in services. And basically what we mean by trade in services is how do we actually provide or deliver services. And there are actually various ways by which we can actually provide these services or supply these services. It can be cross-border, it can be by consumption abroad, and it can be by setting up operation or commercial presence, or it can be by movement of natural person, as was earlier pointed out. This classification of the way by which we provide trade and services is actually something that, for some of you who are familiar with the general agreements on trade and services, is very much well defined on what they mean by supplying trade and services by cross-border. And an example of that, as you can see, is telemedicine, which is actually very much in demand nowadays. And of course, when we talk of consumption abroad, an example of this are those students who are actually entering other countries to take up postgraduate education services, and so forth and so on. Now, while you have all these services sectors, and while you already know what trade and services means, it means delivering, supplying services across the different jurisdictions or across the different territories among the parties, participating parties in the RCEP. What are we actually talking about in terms of what the agreement or the chapter actually provides? Now, the chapter actually provides, as already mentioned, rules and market access, and I call these obligations. The participating parties, or the 15 participating parties to the RCEP, actually enter into negotiations to agree on obligations that would guide or that would be observed or adhered to by the participating parties when trade in services take place between and across the participating countries. Okay, these obligations or commitments are actually manifestations of what the like-minded countries manifest in terms of manifesting the principles of multilateralism in terms of freer trade, non-discrimination, predictability and transparency, and fair competition. So all these obligations that you see on the screen and was earlier discussed are actually manifestations by which all the participating parties to RCEP agree to uphold in terms of providing fair competition, in terms of non-discriminating service suppliers from other parties, in terms of providing a predictable and transparent business environment, and providing an open market to trade to providers or suppliers of trade and services across regions. Now, I wouldn't delve much on what these obligations are, but maybe just very quickly, when we talk of national treatment, it basically means that as a service supplier, for example, I'm a foreign service supplier, and if I'm from country A to country B, I'm a foreign service supplier, and I want to enter the jurisdiction or the territory of country A, I would be treated in the same manner as they treat their national. So this is in a way one manifestation by which non-discrimination is observed. Basically, I am being given national treatment by the other participating country. Market access has more to do with being able to provide the service and being able to operate. Okay. Most favored nation, it means that you will not be a service provider will not be discriminated against service suppliers from other parties and non-parties. So an example of this, if country B has another FTA with another country, and that is given a favorable and more preferential treatment, that treatment should also be extended to the participating countries in RCEP. Local presence has already been described. Now, all these obligations are actually explained in legal language in the Trade and Services chapter of the RCEP. Now, the question is, where do these apply and how do these apply? Okay. For example, national treatment, when we say that all services providers will be treated in the same manner as they treat domestic service suppliers, there is also recognition, by the way, by the parties that in each country there are actually existing rules and regulation which may not necessarily or automatically conform with these obligations. One example that was mentioned earlier is a foreign equity requirement. Okay, limiting, for example, participation of a foreign national to enter a certain territory or jurisdiction by limiting his participation to 40% or 50% or 60% foreign equity. So in effect, that is discriminatory, and that is non-conforming to the national treatment obligation. So what we are actually seeing now is that these services commitments that you see in the annexes are actually manifestations of also the recognition that exists the part of regulations that do not necessarily conform with these obligations that you see in that are actually embedded or fully described in the legal text of the agreement. So basically, the question is, where do this national treatment, where do this market access, MFN, and local presence apply to? And if they apply to a certain sector, to what extent do they apply? Okay. Is it 100%? Is it up to 40%? Is it up to 60%? Or are there certain constraints or restrictions that would have to be abided or followed by service suppliers from the other parties. Now, under the chapter on trade and services, as already mentioned, the participating countries, given the diverse nature of the participating countries, where we have 15 countries, some are developed countries, some are developed economies, some are developing, and some are least developed, you would understand why the scheduling modality or approaches, why there are two scheduling modalities and approaches, and why the parties actually have options. Okay? They can either choose to schedule their commitments, or they can either choose scheduling non-conforming measures. Okay. I think this is a bit of a tricky part, because why the difference? And how do you actually read them? And that is actually the meat of what we're going to discuss a bit later. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, while we have, at the very beginning, while we have the schedule of commitments and schedule of NCM for some parties would have schedule of commitments, some other parties would have schedule of non-conforming measures. Okay. Clearly, at the end of the day, the objective is that everyone would move, okay, on to having a schedule of non-conforming measure. And that is why we have a transition period that was already mentioned by Wadrina in her presentation. So at this present stage, this is where the countries stand in terms of whether they opted to schedule their commitments using the positive list approach, or whether they opted to schedule their non-conforming measures using the negative list approach. But at the end of the day, towards a certain point in the period or in the timeline of RCEP, you would see everyone already moving towards that direction of only having schedule of NCM or non-conforming measure, and that is what we call the transition period. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, which countries? As I mentioned, countries have options, whether they would like to schedule their commitments in trade and services using the positive list approach or the negative list approach. The green one, or the tail one, schedule of specific commitments, is actually reflected as Annex 2. And the schedule of reservations and non-conforming measure, which basically follows the negative list approach, uses is actually Annex 3 in the RCEP agreement. Now, which countries have actually used the schedule of specific commitments or follow the positive list approach? This is based on the RCEP website, and as you can see, there are about 8 countries. 6 of them are actually ASEAN countries who have scheduled, or which have scheduled their services commitments using the positive list approach. And we call this schedules of specific commitment. Mainly, this would cover all modes of supply from modes 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, when we talk of this modes positive list and this modes of supply, 1, 2, 3, and 4, this basically follows what we are familiar with, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Services. For those who are familiar with the WTO General Agreement on Trade and Services, it actually follows the positive list approach, and that is also what we currently have in the ASEAN framework, or being followed under ASEAN, under the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Trade, ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services. So basically, this one would somehow would mirror that approach. Okay? But of course, there would be difference in terms of the content, because this one is negotiated under the RCEP ambit. Okay. Now, for those that have followed the schedule of reservations and non-conforming measures, or who have adopted the negative list approach, you can see on the screen that this would include, okay, the developed economies, Australia, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand. It would also include those countries in ASEAN who are part of TPP, Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. Okay. As for the others, you can see that we also have Cambodia, Myanmar, Lao PDR, Philippines, but this talks of a different chapter. This talks of services, of investment. Now focusing on services, you can see that these are Brunei Darussalam, Indonesia, Myanmar, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand. Now you might wonder what's the distinction? What is the difference between services and investment? We wouldn't go deep into investment, but just suffice it to say that when it comes to ASEAN, anything related to investment in the context of ASEAN would actually be limited to 5 sectors: manufacturing, mining, agriculture, fishery and forestry, and services incidental to those sectors. But anything related to services is covered either here in the Annex 3 or in Annex 2. If there are any questions later to clarify this, I'll be happy to respond to some of your queries, because I know it's a bit of a complex thing to make this distinction. But suffice it to say that when we talk of schedules of specific commitments for services, it is in Annex 2, and it basically follows the GATS approach of positive list. And it covers all modes 1, 2, 3, and 4, and covers all services sectors. When we talk of the schedule of reservations and non-conforming measures, which is Annex 3, it follows the negative list approach. And for services, the countries that follow this approach are, again, Brunei, Indonesia, Myanmar, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, Japan, China, Korea, and Korea. Next slide, please. Now, this is a bit technical, and I have to apologize, but basically this is just for the listeners to actually understand what we talk of the schedule of, what is this schedule of commitments that we are talking about, because this is going to be a very important document, especially for the business sector who would like to see what are the areas that are open to them for investment, what are the areas where they can actually participate and provide service or supply services across across the borders within or among the participating parties. Okay. Now, under the schedule of commitments, which is under Article 8.7, as I've said, okay, some parties opted to use the schedule of commitments or the positive list approach, and we've already identified these countries. So basically, what these countries have actually done is they set out, okay, their national treatment and or market access commitment that they are willing to undertake to a specific sector or subsector. Okay, so meaning to say, they set out the national treatment and market obligations, the limitations up to what extent would be the market access obligation, up to what extent would be the national treatment obligation for a specific sector. So in this case, a country or a participating country would have to identify which sectors they would be making or they would be making a commitment on. And once they decide which sectors or subsectors, they would have then to identify whether the commitments that they are going or willing to give is to give market access or national treatment. And whether the next question is, what would be the extent of this access? What would be the extent of this national treatment? Okay. So clearly what needs to be identified here, and for those who are for the business community, you would be more interested on what are the terms, limitations, and conditions for national treatment for market access. Okay. Am I allowed to invest 100%, let's say in advertising services? Am I allowed to open a corporation in another country? Am I allowed, okay, to do online trading, okay, of services? Okay. So these are the things that are critical information will be of value to the business community. So as you can see on the screen, what you have is an identification of what are the sector or subsectors. Okay? The first part on the horizontal commitments means that these are the obligations that participating countries are willing to extend to the other parties. Horizontally, it means it applies to all sectors. So for example, if they would say that I have no restrictions on market access, then the entry would be such. There are no restrictions or none. But they would also have sector-specific commitments. Now, the sector-specific commitments, as I've said earlier, there are a number of services sectors, but participating countries actually opt, okay? They decide which services sector, which subsector are they willing to make a commitment. So they specify, in this particular case, advertising services. So they need to specify that they are making a commitment on advertising services. But to be very particular about it, they also specified the Central Product Classification 871, because this gives a description of what would be the extent of that advertising services they are willing to commit in terms of market access and in terms of national treatment. Okay. Now, another example is on audiovisual services. And as you can see, this is just one example. There are so many sub-areas of audiovisual services, but what we have indicated here is just one aspect of it. It's very particular. They really have to define and be very clear as to where they would be providing market access. It is only on the production services of animated cartoons of any kind, not for local broadcasting or distribution. So there are further qualifications in terms of what would be the sector and subsector that would be covered by the commitment. Now, if you look at the other columns, this is a bit tricky, and I apologize, but this is the way this is actually constructed. This is the way the schedule of commitments are actually constructed. We follow the GATS scheduling approach, and this is how they did it in GATS, and this is how it's being done in the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Trade and Services. So basically, we're talking the lingo of GATS. Okay. Now, you would see there some numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and these numbers actually correspond, okay, to the way by which services can actually be supplied. 1 actually refers to cross-border supply. An example of this, as I earlier gave, would be telemedicine. These are basically services that are coursed through technology, through online transactions, through online mediation, to telecommunications and support and so on. Okay. Now, mode 2 is consumption abroad. One example of this would be tourists who come to your country, or students who come to your country to study. Okay. Now, 3 is actually, mode 3 is one that you are most familiar with. This refers to commercial presence or the setting up of entities or corporations or joint ventures. And we call this mode 3. Mode 4 is something that there is go back. Mode 4 actually refers to movement of natural persons, where the service is actually provided by a natural person. Now, in terms of what those words or terms that you see, non, unbound, up to 70%, what these are actually, okay, the extent of the commitment that is being extended by a participating country. Okay. When we say none, you would have to go back to the agreement and perhaps to the technical guidelines later on, because I know that it's kind of difficult to actually get used to these terminologies, but this is the language by they speak in the schedule. Basically, what it means is that when they put none here, there are no restrictions in as far as market access is concerned. When they say unbound, it means that they are not making any commitment with respect to mode 4 or movement of natural persons. When they say up to 70% foreign equity, it means that this is the only existing limitation on market access, and they allow up to 70% foreign equity participation. So And then if you go to the other side, which is limitation on national treatment, the same is true. When you see the word none, 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 it means that there are no constraints or limitations being imposed in as far as national treatment for advertising services is concerned. However, what I would just like to mention is that when you talk of sector-specific commitments, you would have to read this with the horizontal commitments. So let's move to the next slide, please. Okay. One aspect that's been mentioned by Wadrina earlier is that along with the schedule of services commitments is the identification of future liberalization. So there is also this appendix that some countries may have included in their schedule where they identify the other services sectors which they are willing to open up in the future. And that is why they have classified it for future liberalization. This is just an example of one of those that we have seen in the schedules of commitments. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, this one is the other annex. This is Annex 3. The Annex 3 on the schedules of non-conforming measures or reservations. So the other countries that have opted for these have already been mentioned. But basically, this approach uses this schedule uses the negative list approach. What it does is that all the obligations that do not apply or do not conform, to the obligations at the national, regional, and local level have to be listed down. Okay. So you have all those NT, MA, MFN, and LP obligations. If there are any existing measures in your domestic laws, rules, and regulations that do not conform to the NT, MA, MFN, and LP obligations, then you have to list it down in this Annex 3. Okay. So an example of that is, can you bring it up? Okay. For this one, number one sector, it applies to all sectors. So this is your equivalent to horizontal commitments. But basically what it says is that on national treatment, for investment, there is a requirement, that the business license may only be granted for nationals for the operation of so forth and so on. Okay? And then it also identifies the source of measure. So the beauty of this negative list approach is it gives the business community a snapshot already. Okay, what are the obligations? What are the restrictions for this particular subsector or sector? And because it gives a description, it also tells them, where can we find this restriction? These measures can be found in the following rules and regulations or laws of the country or of the participating country. So it's very predictable, it's very transparent in that regard. In addition to this, there is also another list under this annex where a country or participating party can actually set out the sector, subsectors, activities in which they can impose future obligations. So this is actually where some countries can have policy space. So not everything is actually listed in list A, but there are some sectors that can be listed out in list B, and future commitments or future obligations can be made by any of the participating countries. Next slide, please. An important note that I would just like to give to the business community is when you look at the schedule of commitments, of course, very important is to understand the legal text and then to also to see the schedule of commitments. But very important also is the explanatory notes to the annex, because it gives you an idea, it explains to you what the annex is made of, that is in accordance with the specific provisions of the agreement. It also explains to you how it was prepared. It also gives clear definition of certain terms as they use it in the context of their countries. the use of certain terminologies are further clarified in this regard. Okay. So before you can venture into the annex itself, it would actually be important to actually understand these explanatory notes because it gives you that added information to understand it very well. Next slide, please. Now, another important document, and this is actually already mentioned also, for those countries that have actually opted for the scheduling of commitments, Annex 2, in scheduling their commitments to trade and services, is to also come up with a transparency list. So this is, as already mentioned, non-legally binding, and so the sole purpose is only for transparency purposes. Okay, and you can see the requirement on what kind of information should be provided. So again, it's somewhat similar to what you already saw in the negative list, where they identify the sector, subsector. They also identify the inconsistency. They also identify the reference or the legal source, and they provide a description, succinct description of the measure. But again, while they have this list, okay, for those sectors, for those countries that have opted for the schedule of commitments, these are non-legally binding. This is only for transparency purposes. Next slide, please. Okay. Again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, okay, countries or the participating countries have the option to schedule their commitments using schedule of commitments and schedule of MCM. But at some point towards some period in time, everyone would have to transition to the schedule of NCM. So those countries that have actually scheduled their commitments using the positive list approach, and these are the 8 countries which we have identified earlier, they would have to transition based on an agreed schedule to NCM or to scheduling of NCMs or schedule of reservations. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, important notes for parties making commitments under Article 8 or Schedule of Commitments. This is just to highlight to the business community also that while countries who are using Schedule of Commitments for scheduling their trade and services commitments, they are also bound, okay, to transition. And these are the important notes for the transition. Okay. So transitioning parties, those that we have identified as 8 participating countries, would have to submit proposal to the Committee on Services and Investment for circulation to the other party. And whatever they propose as their proposed schedule of reservations or non-conforming measures, they would have to be vetted, verified, and clarified by the other parties. Okay? This is not a time for negotiation, but basically for verification and clarification. The important point here is that for those parties who are submitting their proposed schedule of reservations, they should provide equivalent or greater level of liberalization than what they have in their schedule of commitments. Okay. As we mentioned here, the proposed schedule should not be lesser or should not decrease the level of commitments prior to transition. Again, there is a note at the bottom part. What I would like to highlight is in terms of the transition period, there is a special treatment with respect to Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar. They're given more time in terms of the transitioning period. Next slide, please. Now, this is just in summary, just to give everyone the difference between the scheduling modalities. Those who are using the positive list, so not all sectors are listed. They list commitments on select sectors in the schedule, and they do not necessarily reflect regulatory practice. And that is why it is also important to have that transparency list for everyone to see, while that is non-legally binding for everyone to have some sense of transparency on what are the existing rules and regulations that affect trade and services. Now, with respect to the negative list, it covers all sectors, because all the sectors would have to be listed in either list A or list B. They only list measures that are inconsistent to the obligations of NP, MA, MFN, and LP. Those that are outside the list would mean that they are actually open with respect, or they are open in that regard. Okay. List A reflects measures that are subject to regulatory, reflex measure at the level of regulatory application or domestic regulatory regime at present. List B would include those measures that gives policy space to the countries in terms of undertaking future commitments in those sectors. One of the important aspects of adopting the negative list and as used in RCEP is the standstill obligation and ratchet obligation. When we say standstill, the obligations that they have actually listed in list A and in list A would mean that these are actually the minimum guarantee. There is no backtracking in that regard. So for example, if they say 50% foreign equity or 60% foreign equity is allowed, then that is the minimum that can be given to a service supplier. Ratchet obligation simply means that if a country or a participating party in the future decides to undertake unilateral liberalization, further opening up of a certain sector with respect to a specific obligation, it means that that will be extended. That can be extended to the other parties in the RCEP agreement. Next slide, please. Well, that ends my presentation. Thank you very much. And terima kasih. If you have questions, maybe we can address those later on in the open talk. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Glenda. Yes, if you have any questions, just feel free to use the chat box and we will be back to your questions shortly after the panel discussions. So moving on, our next presenter is our Senior Project Officer at the ASEAN Secretariat, Ms. Yuanita. Nita will present the Annex on Telecommunication Services under the RCEP Agreement. Over to you, Nita.
Okay, thank you, Fendi. Good afternoon, everyone. For this occasion, as previously mentioned by the moderator, I will provide an overview of what it is in the Annex on Telecommunication under RCEP Agreement. So next slide, please. Okay. I will start with what is actually an Annex on Telecommunication Services and what the Annex is for. The Annex on Telecommunication is a set of binding framework of rules specifically for telecommunication services. It sets some obligations complementary to the obligations and commitments specified in the chapter on trade and services as already presented by Wadrina, and also to the telecommunication services commitments specified in the country-specific schedule of commitments, which is Annex 2, and schedule of reservation and non-conforming measures, also known as Annex 3. This is to facilitate foreign competition in the telecommunication sectors and to open telecommunication networks and infrastructure to be accessed by foreign providers. So the rules here, those obligations and commitments in the Annex are aimed to enable foreign telco companies from RCEP countries to enter RCEP market without facing discriminatory treatment as compared to the domestic companies. The Annex also guarantees equal access to telecommunication networks on a discriminatory basis with a view to enhance competition. So usually, creating condition for cross-border provision of services and open markets in telecommunication services mostly involve compelling established national or local telecommunication providers. They usually called major suppliers to allow foreign competitors access to their existing networks. The existing networks and infrastructure that enables transmission of telecommunication services were typically built at the public expense through government entities or heavily regulated monopolies, which would then give foreign companies access to existing networks, the existing local networks at really high cost. So with this Annex, it actually tries to address that issues by guaranteeing equal and non-discriminatory treatment. It also tries to accommodate the emerging market of telecommunication services, market consolidation of regional telecommunication suppliers in the midst of mergers and acquisition, as well as increase of competition in the telecommunication sectors. It's also aimed to strengthen the backbone of ICT infrastructures and also to support and facilitate trade in services directly, and also trade in goods and investment among parties in general. Next slide, please. So what the Annex telecommunication covers and what it doesn't cover. So the Annex applies to here, the Annex on telecommunication applies to measures be it laws or regulation or policy affecting trade in public telecommunication services, particularly to those rules or regulations that related to access, how a company can access and use, foreign companies can access, or how to use the public telecommunication networks or services. It also have rules related to obligation of the suppliers of the public telecommunication networks or services. What is actually, maybe you are wondering what is actually public telecommunication services. Here, I include the extract from the text agreement itself, saying that public telecommunication here means that any kind of telecommunication services required by a country to be offered in public to public in general, while the telecommunication network itself is an infrastructure that is used to provide the public telecommunication services. So the Annex, however, in the sense like the Annex doesn't apply to telecommunication networks or services that are not offered to public generally. In other words, those networks that are built for private consumption or for a designated use, for example, military use or government or even private companies, the telco supplier who supply this type of telecommunication services will not be obliged to the rules in this Annex. Also, the Annex doesn't apply to telecommunication sectors that are not committed in the country specific commitments, Annex 2 and Schedule of Reservation and NCM. I think we have seen what is Annex 2 and Annex 3 looks like from the presentation by Glenda. So here the obligation only apply to the sectors that are committed there. So for example, if say a country A does not list out in electronic mail sector or as service sector or telex services in their Annex 2, it means that the obligation doesn't apply to the provision of electronic mail or telex services in that country. Similarly, to the country who adopt negative list approach, if say the electronic mail is listed in their reservation list as a reservation list in their NCM Annex 3, it means that it doesn't apply to that sector as well. However, whether or not it is not committed in Annex 2 or Annex 3, the Annex also doesn't apply to the supply of the cable and broadcast distribution or radio television programming. However, it may apply if it is only to ensure that the cable or broadcast services supplier have access and use to the public telecommunication networks and services. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we move on to the elements of Annex on telecommunication services. Here in the screen are the list of main elements in the Annex. So basically, in ASEAN, apart from RCEP, there are only 2 other ASEAN +1 FTA that have Annex on telecommunication, which is ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Area, we call ANSFATA, and ASEAN, Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or we call AGCEP. And the other one is the Internal ASEAN Trade in Services Agreement, or what we call ATISA. So RCEP on telecommunications basically consists of 23 articles apart from the 2 articles, which are definition and scope, there are 21 elements constitute this chapter, this annex services, telecommunications services, ranging from those which are WTO standard elements to those that are WTO plus elements. Also, so with this comparison, we can see how far actually we have improved from the standard WTO GATS annex, and also approved that annex RCEP Annex on Telecommunication Services is by far the most comprehensive annex among ASEAN FTA. So in summary, there are 10 elements under RCEP that are WTO standard, be it is listed in the Annex on Telecommunication itself, WTO Annex on Telecommunication, such as access and use of such as article on access and use and transparency. Also, although or it listed in the WTO basic telecommunication reference paper. The level of commitments for some of these elements that are also in RCEP may or may not differs from what when it was committed under WTO. For example, like universal services, elements on universal services, basically has the same commitments with the one in WTO. But for others, there are some improvement in the level of commitments and obligations. Here we also have 5 elements, such as number of portability, treatment of major supplier, resale, co-location, provisioning and pricing of lead circuit services, which are WTO plus, but already existed in the past ASEAN FTA, such as UNFATA, AGCP, and ATISA. There are also 2 newer elements, such as international submarine cable and international mobile roaming, that were not existed in ASEAN external FTA, but is introduced in the ATISA, the Internal ASEAN Agreement for Services. So in addition to those elements mentioned earlier, the RCEP actually included 4 new elements that were not existed in the previous ASEAN FTA, including ATISA. These are, if you can see in the green shade, there are approaches to regulations, unbundling of network elements, access to poles, ducts and conduits, flexibility in the choice of technology. Maybe I will explain on that a bit later. These elements are also existed in TPP, and these are actually new obligations necessary to accommodate the development of new technology in the services of supply of telco services. Next slide, please. So what are those elements and obligation means for business? In summary, at least we have I have identified at least maybe 5 benefits of the Annex of Telco for business. Number 1 is to promote neutrality and competitive rules. Telecommunications has always been considered as one of the most important yet sensitive sector because how it is being used as a means for communication and to disseminate information for public. This can create many governments to be protective in the provision of technology telecommunications services supply. It was not easy for foreign telecommunication supplier to provide services to other countries. This has become an issue, especially if with the current condition, especially with COVID, almost all activities and business transactions are heavily rely on telecommunications. So in order to provide telecommunication services, and telco provider needs to establish a set of infrastructure that are quite costly. Hence, many of these company can only be many of this infrastructure can be established and owned only by big companies with a lot of investment, and or what they call here major supplier. So in practice, the small telco player usually doesn't own infrastructure, and to reduce the cost, they usually lease the expensive infrastructure from the major supplier. These conditions eventually tend to make a major supplier to do monopoly practice and to provide special treatment only to those affiliated with the major supplier. This treatment also experienced by the foreign telco providers who wants to provide services in another country. So in order to address this issue, the Annex also promotes neutrality and competitive rules, which aims to remove the discriminatory treatment and anti-competitive practice. Though this Annex, through this Annex, government try to commit to ensure that major supplier who provides access to foreign suppliers, they have to supply it without a differentiation in rates or procedures or as compared to those who are their affiliates. Some of the elements which are WTO standard includes commitment to guarantee non-discriminatory treatment in the access of and use, interconnection, and allocation of spectrum. Some additional elements, which is WTO plus and exists in other FTA, extends the coverage of these non-discriminatory measures to other elements. For example, the collocation and access to submarine cable system. A new addition in the RCEP, for RCEP, the new addition which doesn't exist in other FTA are the extension of this treatment in best endeavor basis to access poles, ducts, and conduits in any other related infrastructure. This new addition is important for business as it supports the demand of good and affordable internet and fiber optic services. In order for those internet and fiber optics provider to be able to provide their services at a reduced cost, the capability to access the infrastructure owned by local major suppliers such as telecom poles or underground ducts and conduits are now feasible. So next slide, please. So second one is support the ease of doing business. As mentioned previously before, usually when entering a market for economical reason, foreign telecommunication providers try to avoid establishing its own infrastructure and prefer to use existing infrastructure that is available for lease. Elements such as interconnection is aimed to address that issue where foreign suppliers are guarantees access to do interconnection to the local supplier. What is quite new to the standard elements adopted in the GATS are the ability not only to interconnect, but also to co-locate and have access to submarine cable system, which is important for internet fiber optics provider. This annex also provide opportunity to do resale of the telecommunication services and also to apply number portability to mobile services. Number portability is quite beneficial for business persons or inter-corporate transferee who often move around across region, as they will be able to retain and use the same phone number they have when they move to other country and switch providers to use the that country providers. However, to note that these elements are still considered technically and economically difficult to be applied in some ASEAN member states. For RCEP, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar even opt out for the application of this element. Moreover, there are two newest additions to the RCEP Annex that are not previously in the ASEAN FTA, where this Annex actually provides some opportunity for foreign suppliers to access network elements and on an unbundled basis. With this provision, it will benefit the foreign telco suppliers by allowing flexibility for them to choose the network elements they require when they are setting up the business. So usually local major supplier tends to offer telco infrastructure in a bundle package. So it's like take it or leave it deal. Sometimes some elements in the package may not be necessary to the foreign suppliers. So with these new elements in the RCEP Annex, major suppliers are able to list the infrastructure according to their needs. Another new element is government are allowing flexibility for the foreign telecommunication suppliers to use any technology of their choice in supplying telco services. However, government may still apply regulation to limit the choice of technology if they feel that country are not prepared to adopt the technology. But as long as those regulations does not create unnecessary obstacles or barriers to trade. Next slide, please. The Annex also tries to improve transparency and good practices. The Annex promotes transparency as well as good regulatory practices. RCEP Annex as well as other FTA commitments requires that information regarding access and use, licensing, interconnection procedures and agreement to be provided publicly. This is important as it will provide telco providers with undue influence in their decision-making process when they plan to enter a market. One addition that is important for RCEP is that the Annex also provide opportunity for foreign suppliers to not only be provided information on the proposed new draft regulation or laws in that country, but also they will be given a chance to provide view and comments to the draft proposal, the draft regulation proposal. This can be seen as an effort to improve good regulatory practice, as it also includes foreign telecommunication companies in the loop of that process. Next slide, please. This is going to be my final slide, I think. Since we are all aware, so for the fourth benefit is maintaining the use of global standards. Since we are all aware that telco industry is one of the fastest changing industry in terms of technology innovation. So to always copy the latest development, the Annex continue to its commitment to maintain and promote international standards for global compatibility and also interoperability of the telecommunication sector. As for the last benefit, the Annex provide resolution of disputes. Also, it is actually also included in the Annex Telecommunication and other FTA. The Annex in the RCEP provides resolution of telecommunication disputes. While standards GATS coverage, the coverage only for disputes is only for issue on interconnection. But in the RCEP as well as other recent FTA, the commitment has been extended to also be cover all issues under the Annex. So this will mean that telecommunication companies will be given opportunity to recourse to their telecommunication regulatory body in case of to resolve dispute in case there is a dispute in the telecommunication services. Okay, so that I think that's the end of my presentation. I hope my presentation provide better insight for you in understanding the Annex on telecommunication services. Thank you. Back to you, Fendi.
All right, thank you, Nita, for the excellent presentation. So we're moving on to our last presenter. We have Mr. Muhammad Hazim Abdul Rahman. He's the Internal Trade and Investment Lead Negotiator at the Bank Negara Malaysia. He will walk us through the Annex on Financial Services and related area under RCEP Agreement. You may have the screen, Hazim, please.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. All right. I think the earlier presentation on the services chapter has provided an adequate overview on the philosophy, fundamentals, and the broad structure of the agreement. Building on that momentum, I think, and taking into account the feedback from market participants based on our engagement with our stakeholders, it is difficult to decipher treaty text. Hence, my presentation today is structured on a step-by-step approach and using layman terminologies for ease of understanding, especially for business community. There are 5 steps to this presentation. Step 1, I'll be covering a broad overview of the architecture of the agreement and how it applies to financial services. And in step 2, I will be covering the key elements within the agreement and a comparison with other ASEAN agreements. Step 3, the extent of commitments. Step 4, a snapshot of market access covered in the agreement. And step 5, illustration on opportunities to be reaped by business community. Move on to the next slide, please. There are various chapters in the agreement which would apply to financial services. Let's start with the first one. Financial services is an annex to the trade in services chapter. Hence, obligations in the chapter would apply to financial services as long as they are consistent with obligation covered in the annex. On the other hand, the annex provides a comprehensive coverage of obligations and policy space concerning financial services sectors. I'll deep dive into this in the next couple of slides later. Second, the RCEP also made commitments relating to movement of natural person for financial services. I think Wadrina did cover a little bit on this area during her presentation. Based on our observation, there are some areas of improvements in the level of commitments made by ASEAN member states compared to other ASEAN +1 FTAs. For the investment chapter, while there could be other relevant elements that may concern financial services, I think it is good if I can highlight that the transfer obligation should stand out in this chapter. For business community, this is crucial as it provides a guarantee to investors to carry out transfers transactions relating to their investments. This guarantee, which must be honored by financial services regulators, would be applicable not just to financial services investors, but in fact to all economic agents which are covered under this chapter. Although in this agreement today, we do not have the coverage on the investor state dispute settlement mechanism, I think having this transfer protection would ensure that investors' rights are preserved. Currently, based on our surveillance, there have been a couple of dispute cases between investors and host countries in relation to this obligation. Next, the fourth thing that while financial services sector is excluded from a couple of key provisions in the chapter of e-commerce, it does not mean that for purposes of e-commerce, financial services sector will not be involved. In fact, in our annex, some provisions are covered in the annex with a wider scope of obligation and not limited to the activity for e-commerce transactions only. Lastly, based on this architecture, I would like to highlight and mention that an important provision is built into the general provisions and exception chapter. From the perspective of financial services regulators, there is a specific article on balance of payment safeguard which provides forward guidance on the exception and disciplines allowed for regulators in the event of crisis. On that front, investors can gauge what kind of measures that will be implemented by financial services regulators in the event of crisis or threats thereof. Moving on to the next slide. This is slightly different and it may not be covered in other presentations in the past regarding the RCEP. Although I recognize that the RCEP has been subject to increasing scrutiny and the topic of discussion since its signing, we attempt to debunk this perception by undertaking a specific exercise to rank the degree of obligation under the agreement vis-a-vis other enforced ASEAN +1 FTAs. In this exercise, I have also included the CPTPP just to provide a sense of liberalization undertaken in the agreement. A little bit on the methodology, perhaps, if I could explain detail a bit more, we modeled our exercise on the Hoopman Index, an index developed to measure market access commitments in the positive phase agreement. We extrapolated it and then we further enhanced it by introducing a set of weightages to ensure relative significance of obligations is well addressed in our calculation. Based on the final score, we could see that the RCEP tops at the ASEAN Plus 1 FTA and stood only behind the CPTPP. And of course, this methodology does not, in any case, lead to the outcome of the upcoming cost-benefit analysis using a specific modeling techniques to really measure the pace of liberalization and the benefits accrued to the economies. The high score indeed recorded is underpinned mainly by the incorporation of contemporary obligations in addition to typical core obligations covered in the agreement. Move on to the next slide. Now, let's deep dive into our specific assessment on two obligations just to give a flavor in terms of the technique that we use to assess the pace of liberalization undertaken under the RCEP. The first one would be transparency, and the second one would be new financial services obligation for illustration purposes for today's discussion. For the item number one on the transparency obligations on the left-hand side of the slide, using the same methodology, the transparency article in RCEP Annex has a score equivalent to ASEAN Plus 1 FTAs and the CPTPP. This is quite encouraging because while there were a lot of scrutiny in terms of the pace of liberalization for the RCEP, but for financial services, with regards to this article on transparency, we noted that the score is equivalent to the CPTPP. Next, in terms of for new financial services, is relatively new for ASEAN member states. This obligation outlines what would be defined as new financial services from the perspective of financial services regulators and what kind of disciplines that must be adhered to for financial institutions to render this kind of services. Although it is new to some of the ASEAN member states, the degree of obligation is somewhat encouraging. It is somewhere in between the performance or the liberalization undertaken under the ASEAN Trade and Services Agreement and the CPTPP. Moving on to the next slide, I'll be touching a bit.
Your voice is a bit soft from our end, so if you could come closer to the microphone, please. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Next, moving on to our assessment on market access for financial services. In addition to what I have covered, we also observe new opportunities for financial services suppliers to gain greater market access beyond existing ASEAN Plus 1 FTAs, particularly from Australia, Japan, and Korea. For example, there are opportunities to supply auxiliary services for insurance on a cross-border basis to new markets such as Australia, Japan, and Korea. Moving on to the next slide, an illustration on how the business community can tap opportunities from RCEP. In the presentation, I cover two kind of services. On the left-hand side, on the top panel of the slide, you could see buy now, pay later structure. This is a structure where a lot of financial services suppliers are embarking on. And the right-hand side of the top panel in the presentation slide, I cover the digital investment management scheme. Given the pace of development, I think it is important for me to highlight this article or this obligation on new financial services for illustration purposes. This obligation would provide enough opportunities for financial institutions to penetrate into RCEP jurisdiction. However, subject to certain conditions, then a financial institution operating in RCEP jurisdiction can consider rendering these services. Based on my reading, there are three key parameters that financial services supplier or financial institution needs to observe prior to rendering these services in the jurisdiction. First, the service must be a new financial service which has never been supplied in RCEP host country. Second, the new financial service must already be supplied by a financial institutions in the RCEP home country. And third, there must be a specific regulation to allow the supply of new financial services in the territory of the host country. I think with that, I end my presentation. I'm happy to receive any queries or questions regarding commitments made under the Financial Services Annex and the illustrations that I have covered in the presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Hazim, for the comprehensive presentation. And also thanks to all of our speakers. So moving on to the next part of the program, we have panel discussions. This session will discuss on the implications and the future prospect of the RCEP in the area, which just presented by our speaker. And we will be having our, this discussion will be facilitated by Mr. Lee Quang Ban as the moderator. He is the head of ICT and tourism at the ASEAN Secretariat. So take it away, Lan.
Thank you very much. And first, I also express my thanks to the previous speakers, Marisa, Nita, Glenda, and Raman, for very comprehensive. Actually, that it already set a standard of understanding for the audience. And I know that there are three key messages that I think that I need to convey to the audience, because I know that we have a very different level of knowledge and background. So first, I think the first thing is that we may appreciate the new ambitious commitment undertaken under the RCEP that would provide a more transparent, a greater certainty, more predictability for the businesses. And the second, it is really a forward-looking agreements where the member country actually try to upgrade the commitments from the negative listing to a positive listing, from the general principle into a more operational commitments, for example, in the neutrality of technology or competitions. And lastly, that I also want to advise the business community that I know that this is a very intensive knowledge and information, but when you want to consider the impact of the agreement to your business, you really need to look into a detailed and concrete outcome of the text, and you should be aware and understand the detailed interpretation of this agreement. So for that, I want to turn over to to three great panelists who will give you a little bit more insight about the impact, about the overview of this agreements in the context of the ASEAN integration. So may I first want to introduce Dr. Doni from IRIA, who will present the impact of the RCEP service agreement to the business community. Please go ahead, Dr. Doni.
Thank you, Quang. It's good to see you and friends from the Secretariat. And I really thank the organizers, the ASEAN Secretariat and the East Asia Business Council to invite me to talk to this very useful event for all of us. And I do appreciate the panelists from the previous sections that explain a lot about the structures, the content of the services commitments. And I learned a lot for the commitments under RCEP, and I do encourage the Secretariat to have this sort of even more, not only for services but also for the other chapters of RCEP. It's very useful for not only for business people, the client of the trade agreement, but also for academia like myself. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to share a bit of slides to guide my point of discussion. Right. Okay. Oh, thank you. I was right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So, the message that I would like to convey in this talk is I will comment a bit here and there about the commitments, but the basic point that I would like to convey is the implications of the services commitments under RCEP for regional integrations, as well as for growth of the members of the RCEP. As we all know, it's maybe only 1 out of 2 mega FTA currently in place globally, and the other one being CPTPP. So it really matters implementation of this and implication out of implementing this RCEP. Now, next slide, please. I'd like to organize my talk in these 3 key points. The first is, and this is representing some thought from academia perspective, which may be relevant for business as well as for governments, actually. The first is the context. What is the context that we are talking about at this moment in terms of services liberalizations? Second is the importance of modern services. And the third is, of course, the challenges from the pandemic. As we all know, the RCEP is the pre-pandemic FTA. That's what we can say. So, right, next slide, please. Okay, this is the context. Now, RCEP, I guess for many, especially maybe in respect from the negotiators, the officials, as well as the academia, we understand RCEP has one kind of unique objective. And that is, my understanding at least, RCEP would like to facilitate a greater, deeper, and more extensive global value chains. That's the jargon in the regions that we use, global value chains or international production networks. Because global value chains is what has happened in the past 30 years, 3 decades, in ASEAN as well as East Asia, and it has developed, and it has become much more complex these days. You know, the pictures on the right side shows these interconnections of flow of goods between countries. And there's a lot of other pictures that show the complexity of these global value chains. The left-hand side, or with the title of second unbundling, which is the jargon from the trade theory point of view, so basically this global value chains is breaking down the PB, the production blocks, and relocate them across countries or across regions. And obvious question is why then companies would like to relocate them or distribute them across countries. The only reason for that is because it is profitable for them. It's a lot cheaper, for example, for say Toyota to place their production blocks in ASEAN countries, because at the time wages are relatively low compared to the level in Japan, and so on and so forth. And it has been facilitated with open trade and investment regime, even since early 1990s. Now, of course, there is some cost involved in connecting all of these production blocks, and that in the picture, it is indicated by SL, which is service link costs. This is where you talk about logistic costs, talk about the distribution costs, marketing costs, and so on and so forth. So let me get back to that in terms of how this relates to RCEP. Okay, so but the basic message point is that what we understand, RCEP has kind of mission to deepen or to strengthen the growth and expansion of global value chains within the region of RCEP members. And one of the salient features of this, as many of us have heard, is RCEP pledged to have much more relaxed rule of origins in terms of moving inputs, moving inputs in terms of intermediate inputs, goods, or in this context also services, people, services of professionals, for example, across countries. So the basic idea is to support global value chains by making movement of goods and services a lot cheaper between countries. Okay, next slide, please. Now, part of the context is, we know this global value chains has grown so fast in the past 2 or 3 decades, but in the past 1 decade, we are seeing rather not alarming, but maybe concern for some. And that is flattening, maybe the word is flattening importance of trade and investment within ASEAN region. So in the charts here, and this is from the research done by, if not mistaken, EU and ASEAN Secretariat, and published 2019, show that the intra-ASEAN foreign direct investment in terms of share actually is flattening. And actually there is another graph that I didn't put here showing the share of intra-ASEAN trade. There is the trade between only ASEAN countries, bilateral trade between ASEAN countries. The share of this, if we accumulate that, is also has flattening in the past 1 decade, perhaps. Whereas we understand that the aspiration of ASEAN actually is to increase that intra-ASEAN trade. At the same time, you're also seeing here is declining export of services. And this is maybe, although the value increased, but this share is actually declining. So what does it tell us? It tells us one of the hypothetical explanation about this is because ASEAN countries tend to trade more with outsider ASEANs, and that is with their East Asia partners, Japan, Korea, China, including as well as Australia, New Zealand, and India. So over the time, we see this phenomenon, and that means one interpretation out of that is that means and much of that comes from these global value chains interactions. And that means a lot of global value chains actually happen between ASEAN countries and their East Asia partner. And and that is which is fine. And maybe that is what the nature of the market has going to. That is the directions. And actually it gives correct justifications for the existence of RCEP, because it's a trade agreement between the East Asia member states minus India at this point. Right, so that is the context. Another context is ASEAN member states tend to trade more with outsider than with the insider between their ASEAN countries. Next slide, please. And this is and that maybe is also reflected by this high degree variations of trade creations and trade diversions between ASEAN countries. So for Vietnam, for example, countries like Vietnam, Singapore, here Indonesia, and to some extent Malaysia, and also Philippines, still got positive trade creations from the implementation of ASEAN Economic Community, AFTA and AFAS. But then the other countries saw trade diversions. So this could be one motivations of why ASEAN member states tend to trade with their East Asia partners. But the point is, there seems to be some indications that the infrastructures for trade or demand supply for trade within ASEAN regions has weakened somehow. And this, if we are talking in terms of global value chains, and if we go back a bit to that pictures about the production block and service link costs, that suggests there's been some, the service link costs in ASEAN could be now a bit more expensive relative to the service link costs between ASEAN and East Asia countries. So that means, which makes the profitability or the motivations to form or to deepen global value chains is chosen more with the East Asia countries partners or outsiders ASEAN. Now, so that's the context. So we are seeing possibly declining or service global value chains within ASEAN, and that could have been because the service link cost has weakened. So more need to be done to reduce even more the service link cost. Now, next slide, please. Now, and from this, I want to relate this to the what's so-called modern services sectors. So we in area here has now research on RCEP actually, and one of the topic there is this modern services. So what are they? So basically, this modern services is services sectors like financial services, insurance, business services, telecommunications, and logistics. All of these are modern services. So modern services exist when a country, in theory, when a country becoming more developed, and demand for these more sophisticated services, especially for business, has emerged. And in these modern services, much of these modern services really support the manufacturing processes, which really support the globe. That means it really supports the global value chains. So existence of modern services is not only for consumptions by end user, say photocopying service by students, but also consumptions by business sectors. And later on, we see more integrations of the services, business services, modern services into manufacturing process, what we call as a third unbundling. So the spread out of the production blocks under second unbundling only deals with the goods sectors, but later on the more advanced step is the third unbundling, and that is facilitated by these ICT revolutions. Next step, please. Next slide, please. Now, why do these modern services matter? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it happens partly because of the demand from the business sectors, photocopying services, consultancy services, research and development, for example, financial sector, banking, lending institution, fintech, all happens partly because of the demand from the corporation, from the business sectors. And this, that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is as I mentioned also, because of this technology ICT revolution, the process within manufacturing becoming more blurred, and they start to also outsource. That's the word. Outsource the services part within the manufacturing firms. So, for example, in the past, maybe car manufacturers, for example, the design division of that manufacturer is within the company, but these days that is outsourced to independent designer outside the company. So that means services becoming another production block, quote unquote, or services block put outside the company, and that is made possible because of this technology ICT revolutions. Now people can work through internet easily, irrespective of their location. Someone can sitting in Bali, drawing some design and send it to the car manufacturer's headquarters in Japan, for example. So it doesn't matter. So the services providers do not have to be in the same locations of the manufacturers, and so this offers a lot more cheaper cost efficiency for companies, and therefore it is widely adopted. Next slide, please. And this is next slide again. Next, yeah. And this is in theory or in academic jargon what we call servicifications. So that's services becoming more together as well as separate. So in this Smiley curve, for example, you will see R&D and the input side and marketing distributions on the output side, and they all can be separated from the manufacturing service, manufacturing productions. So we have this phenomena. So this is why modern services is important. And in terms of RCEP that has the missions to support global value chains, that means implementations of the commitments of modern services becoming critical, for the success of RCEP. Now, all of this, what is the implications for RCEP? Next slide, please. Implications, and I guess this is the key message from my presentation. My comment is what we expect is that commitments in RCEP can support the change in the policy environment in the member economies in respect to especially the modern services. We know that out of the 15 members of RCEP, there are developed countries and there are least developed and there are developing countries. So for developing and least developed member states, member of the RCEP, the question is how this modern policy environment that can support business services effectively be applied, and that is becoming institutional story. That means how these institutions, how regulations can be swiftly be adjusted to support this commitment in modern services. So I guess that's the basic point. Yeah. So we all have this high ambitious commitments for modern services, but then the question is, can regulatory framework, can institutions in the member of the RCEP countries handle this, the very demanding policy reform out of the coming from the RCEP? For example, earlier we heard about the commitment under telecom. So basically the idea, as far as I understand, is the extended privatizations. So privatization in telecom is a rather old story for countries like Australia, for example. it's no longer an issue there. It's already implemented. But in developing member of RCEP, developing countries and least developed, that could be a big issue. That could be a lot of institutional and regulatory reform need to be done, not to extend the privatization to foreign enterprises, but only to have privatization within domestic economy. That's already a big homework for some countries. So the question is how this policy environment institutions can handle it. So I guess that's a big homework for policymakers. And when it is done, and when it is done properly, I guess a lot of investment opportunities. And this is what RCEP wants to offer eventually. So that's the key message that I would like to address, one of the key points. The next slide, please. Now, to make it a bit more challenging, we have the pandemic. And as we all know, RCEP is the pre-pandemic FTA. It has not yet incorporated the potential impact or the impact of post-pandemic itself. Many people have talked about the speeding up implementation of digitalizations, digital technology, and everything. So that could be one potential challenges. So there is a demand from consumers as well as business for an accelerated digitalizations, and that means implementation of commitments that has some impact on digitalizations will be very critical under RCEP. What I'm saying. So that's one. Second, there is a lot of or there is some evidence on already technology upgrading. So the point is to substitute manpower with machinery, with technology. So because there is a weakness, we all know about labor-intensive industries under the pandemic. So there's already some evidence or some casual observations of firms upgrading their technologies. And if that firms is part of global value chains, then the critical one here is the investment. If we are talking about services commitment, that has something to do with Mode 3. That means how the services, for example, for maintenance and repair, be provided if a company installs robots, for example. If companies suddenly change one part of productions, this is story of automation. Suppose you have a garment company, and out of 4 factories, you substitute one of the factories to becoming automated garment company factory. The question is, maybe it is easy to buy the technology, but then when the technology is installed, the question is, who is going to maintain the technology? That needs to be established. And there is the questions of investment in services sectors, Mode 3, and that relates to Mode 3 in RCEP. So that sort of issues or challenges, actually. So there is a demand for accelerations, implementations of, if we are talking about services here, services commitments under RCEP, that comes as an impact or implication from the pandemic, and that is related to all of that story. But then, that's the last bit of my presentations. But I also want to underline the related to the pandemic, two competing forces. The first is, as we are seeing now, the situation is not yet stable in regard to the pandemic, the mutations and all of this, the vaccines, efficacy of the vaccines, which make a lot of countries be cautious about about opening the borders and about engaging again back to full throttle in globalizations. So this one impact. The other is for investors. Investors will now becoming presumably much more careful in choosing the location of investment, because the uncertainty is still lingering everywhere. So there is actually two combating forces. One, the uncertainty is still high, but then there's a lot of investment need to be done, presumably, and this actually provide opportunities for countries that can do the reform in the wise way, and one way to do it is actually to follow their commitments under RCEP, or to moving even more open than the RCEP. I'll stop there, Kwang, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Johnny, for the insight from the perspective of academy. I really like some of the idea that actually that you very well articulate the idea underpinning the dynamic of the trade in service landscape in ASEAN and in RCEP. So we are more confident that actually the trade in services liberalization actually bring or result more result in trade creation rather than trade diversion. That is really a good thing. The second thing that the second point that you make very clear that we are now at the verge of the third or maybe the second or end of the second unbundling era, or maybe we are at the beginning of the third wave unbundling wave because of the digital technology transformation. Of course, that because of the COVID-19 pandemic. You also highlighted some of the key point that the liberalization trade in service in ASEP actually it deepened the linkages between ASEAN and the external partners. That is really important point, and also it will create a more demanding element for ASEAN to work on further. For example, to intensify our digital skill and how to promote the investment that can absorb more technology, more intellectual property, so that we can sustain the growth of the trade in services within the region. So I thank you very much for a very good point. So it gives a lot of shed a light on the work that the official is now doing in our negotiation. Now the second panelist, the second speaker is really a special one. Dato David and Ravi is also one of my old friend in a good sense. He used to be the former of the RCEP negotiators, also now the former ASEAN senior economic officials, lead of Malaysia, and also now he's the senior advisor to Malaysian government in a number of policies. So I would like to invite Ravi for your presentation. Please go ahead, Ravi.
Thank you very much, Lan, for your kind words. I'm no longer with the government. I'm rather working for a consulting firm based in Singapore. It's called White Rook. Let me share my slide. Right. Yeah, let me see where can I make the slide bigger. Yeah, it's down there. All right. Sorry, Lan, let me just, yep. Yeah, yes, let me start by saying that first of all, I'm very happy to participate in this forum on RCEP for business and trading services. Let me also join the other colleagues in thanking the presenters from the various government ministries and ASEAN Secretariat, Warina, Nita, Azim, and Glenda, and so on. Most of them are really the technical experts. But I think, you know, for the private sector, for the business sector, I think it's too much for them to comprehend the technicalities within a short period of 2 hours. So let me not go into too much of technicality, but rather focus on a few slides. First of all, RCEP is a very significant agreement. It provides a lot of opportunity for the businesses in the 15 member countries, including ASEAN. And if you're talking about services, you know, the 7 of the members are among the top exporters of commercial services, and 9 out of the 15 countries are ranked among the top 30 major global exporters. Now, you have to look at RCEP as a comprehensive agreement, just not in isolation from one. You should not look at services just purely from the services perspective, but rather you should look at the agreement in totality. If you look at the agreement in totality, there are 5 main areas. Of course, market access for the businessmen. They would like to know, you know, is the duty zero, import duty zero, or can I own 100% equity ownership if I'm going to invest in the services sector, for example, in Vietnam, where Lan comes from, or even in Singapore or in Malaysia. So for the private sector, I think it's important for them to be told that, you know, where the opportunities are and what are the sectors that are open for immediate benefit of that they can get. The other aspect is, of course, trade facilitation. And that's like what my earlier colleague, Wadrina mentioned, rules and disciplines are there. I think they have covered in the trading services chapter, the Annex on financial services, telecommunication, and professional services. They are basically the rules and disciplines that governs the supplier of service or the supplier of service through commercial presence. What are the rules that one business need to follow? And of course, there are other chapters on SME and economic and technical cooperation. Now, RCEP, if you look at RCEP compared to other agreements that have been signed by ASEAN, you know, the ASEAN Australia, or ASEAN Japan, ASEAN China, ASEAN Korea, or ASEAN India, you find that, you know, many of these areas are not covered. In fact, this is the first time that RCEP, which is a comprehensive agreement that covers competition policy, intellectual copyright, government procurement, e-commerce, movement of natural persons, custom procedures, trade facilitation, SPS, TBT, and a number of other areas. So if you look at for the private sector, you know, it is important that you recognize that this is a comprehensive agreement. For example, if you are supplying goods, the chapter on customs procedure and trade facilitation is very important because it provides you know, it allows you to clear your goods within 48 hours. If it is perishable, you are allowed to clear your goods within 6 hours. There are such provisions in the custom procedures and trade facilitation. Now, I think given the time, limitation of time, let me just talk about the market access benefits from the services. Now, this is the first free trade agreement in which ASEAN has made substantial commitments, I would say, in the services sector. You know, unlike the manufacturing sector, you know, where most of the ASEAN countries, and including the partners, have very liberal rules, which means that, you know, you can own 100%. Foreign equity ownership of 100% is allowed in most of the manufacturing sector. But unfortunately, when you talk about the services sector are regulated. And this is where RCEP is really significant, because this is the first FTA where the scope of coverage of the services sector or subsectors committed for market access for foreign service supplier or supplier of service to the commercial presence, you find that more than 100 to it's between 100 to 140 services subsectors have been committed by the 15 countries. Individually, each country has committed more than 100 services subsector for liberalization. Now, when you talk about liberalization and you talk about the sectors, what are those sectors? I have listed a few: construction, education, professional services, and as the colleagues earlier mentioned, financial, telecommunication. I think the whole range of sectors that are covered for foreign service suppliers to take advantage of. Now, in terms of foreign equity ownership, yes, the ideal situation is for all countries to allow 100% foreign equity ownership. But unfortunately, in RCEP, I think there are still certain sectors that are regulated where foreign service suppliers are welcome, but they have to form joint ventures or they have to have a local partner. Therefore, you find that while a large number of sectors are liberal in terms of countries allowing them to own 100% foreign equity, but there are also a number of sectors where you find that foreign equity ownership is limited to 51%. So whether it's a positive list or negative list, I would, for the private sector, for the businesses, I would not be too worried. All you need to know is that if you are dealing with a particular, say for example, if you are dealing with computer-related services, and if you want to export those services to, say, Malaysia, all you need to look at is the Malaysian services schedule and see whether if it is in a positive list, if it is listed, then you can come in. If it's a negative list or the as the speakers have mentioned, and if your sector is not in a negative list, it means that it is 100% open, so you can come in. So it's for the business sector, I would not be too much worried about the technicalities, but rather just to look at those lists, whether it's a positive or negative list, and see which are the sectors that are of interest to you, and look at, if it's a positive list, all you need to know is that whether 100% foreign equity ownership is allowed or is there a limitation. If it is a negative list, all you need to know is that if your sector is in that list, then it is very transparent. The rules and regulation are clearly inscribed, and you need to follow those rules. If it is not in the negative list, that means you're lucky that you're allowed to, it's very liberal environment and you're allowed to invest, own 100%. Now, the services chapter, as the colleagues have earlier mentioned, is also allows for facilitated temporary entry and movement of business travelers, professionals and skilled person. I think this is very important. It has not been highlighted. I had looked at the schedules of the individual member countries. Unfortunately, it is not harmonized. For example, if you're a business traveler, if you're going to a particular country in ASEAN, for example, in Indonesia, it might be 3 months. You can, if you're a business traveler, you're allowed to go for 3 months. In some countries, it's 60 days, 2 months. In some countries, it's 6 months or 180 days. So you need to look at the individual country schedule of movement of natural persons. Overall, I would say that RCEP is really a significant agreement in terms of the trade in services, because the scope of coverage of sectors is very, very comprehensive. And if you look at and you compare RCEP services chapter with those in ASEAN +1 FTAs, example, ASEAN China, ASEAN Korea, ASEAN Japan, ASEAN India, I would say that all these individual FTAs only cover about, my modest number would be about 30% of what has been committed in RCEP. So RCEP, is in terms of scope, in terms of coverage, is really comprehensive as compared to the ASEAN +1. Of course, the ASEAN Australia New Zealand agreement is much more comprehensive. I would say that it is almost on par with the RCEP, but there are some areas where RCEP is of course more ambitious compared to the Australia New Zealand. Now, in terms of market access, if those sectors are committed, like my colleague earlier mentioned, the important thing for the private sector, for the businesses to know, is that non-discriminatory treatment. That means you are given the same treatment as a local. If your sector is open and you're allowed to own 100%, you enjoy the national treatment. That means you are treated as a local. There's no discrimination. Of course, unless it is specified clearly in the commitment that, there are certain exemptions or certain exceptions. So if there are no exceptions or exemptions, listed in the commitment or the schedule of commitment, you enjoy the same benefit as those are local. Now, there is also the removal of requirement to set up local offices or representative offices for the delivery of services. So you don't need to have your local presence. I think what Rina mentioned is in a presentation. You can be seated in Australia and you can provide your services from there to someone in Malaysia. You don't need to really have a local office. And in this digitalization age, and with more and more companies moving to digitalization, I think this is a very important provision in the RCEP. Of course, there is also the removal of limitation, unless it is specified in the agreement, unless it's specified in the each country's schedule of market access in terms of number of service supplier, there's no limit. So, and also, the good thing is that there's nothing in the agreement that says you need to employ 80% local or a particular citizen of a particular country. No. For example, if you're investing in Malaysia, it doesn't mean that you have to employ 100% Malaysian. So there's nothing in the RCEP agreement that requires you to fulfill that. Of course, again, I must reiterate for the private sector or the businesses that there are exceptions where it might be specified in some other schedule. So you really need to look at the schedules of the country. And this is of course related to the prohibition of performance requirement as a condition. There should not be any condition imposed, for example, that you need to have at least 30% local content requirements and so on and so forth. So overall, I would say that while in terms of scope of coverage and in terms of some of the rules and regulations that are covered under the Trading Services chapter, I have just picked up a few. Of course, as what Rina mentioned earlier on, the most favored nation, MFN treatment, this is one of the few FTAs where ASEAN has allowed for MFN, meaning that if for example, Malaysia is doing a bilateral agreement with another country, say for example, with United Kingdom next year, and if Malaysia offers something much better to the UK, those will be automatically covered under RCEP. Of course, again, you need to look at those sectors. So in many ways, RCEP is certainly a very balanced agreement in terms of commitments, in terms of trade rules and disciplines. And of course, it binds members to accord priority to trade rules. So I would say that for the businesses, you're protected. Your investments, whether it's in the manufacturing or in the services sector, it is protected. Now, as I said, the liberalization of tariffs, the duties will go down on 90% of the product. Services and investment will certainly lead to a boost in intra-regional trade. And of course, it will of course prompt ASEAN integration. Under the AEC, I would say that even under the AEC, we are not that ambitious, but under RCEP, in some areas, we are very, very ambitious. In fact, even within AEC, we don't even have for example, competition policy or IPR is much more on cooperation. Now, one should also look at RCEP, not as a static agreement. We need to look at market opportunities that might come about with the inclusion of new members. I know India has got a special window to come in immediately after the entry into force of the RCEP agreement. We need to look at Hong Kong, which wants to join RCEP. So there are other countries that are waiting. So overall, I would think that the RCEP has provided a strong foundation for the 15 countries in terms of strengthening the business environment and in terms of creating new opportunities and in terms of providing employment for the growing number of people within the 15 countries. For example, in the next 5 years, ASEAN, which is now 650 million, and it's going to be 720 or 730 million in the next 10 years. And of course, these agreements, I would say, provides an opportunity for us to attract investments, not just into the manufacturing, but into the services sector and create employment. So one has to look at RCEP a comprehensive perspective rather than in isolation. Now, I don't like to say this, while on the one hand, I keep saying that RCEP is a very good agreement, that it provides a lot of opportunity for the businesses. But looking at the agreement, and I've read the agreement many times in recent months, and there are certain limitations, certain observations. There are many footnotes and exemptions or timelines given to the least developed countries of RCEP, as well as to the other. So for the private sector, you really need to look at the footnotes and look at the provisions a bit more closer if you're going to invest in any of the 15 member countries. There is also this general provision subject to domestic laws and regulation. When when I'm coming in to invest, I need to be very clear. But when you put a general phrase that says subject to domestic laws and regulation for the businesses, it creates uncertainties. And of course, there are some countries, for example, I think Australia is one of them. There's a threshold for investments in both services and investment. If you are going to invest in a plantation, I think they're looking at about Australian dollar 200 million or so. So there are screening thresholds for investment, both services and investment. So you need to look at the schedules much more closely. Of course, there are a number of limitations that applies to acquisition of shares in certain government-linked company or corporations. I would say this is very common among the 15 countries. Particularly those who have scheduled in negative list, you can be quite sure that many of them have taken a carve out, or they have included as a non-conforming measure, where there are limitations that if you want to acquire shares in a certain government-linked company or corporations, you will not be able to do so. Now, equity limitation, I mentioned that ideally it should be 100%, but of course not all sectors are given 100%. But I believe in future reviews, some of these issues will be taken up. Now, my other main issue that I would like to suggest is that the transition timeline of 12 years for LDCs and for the 3 years, or 6 years. I think it's 6 years for the other members. I believe it's a bit too long. I think it would be good for the businesses in the region that all of us, we have a single negative list for all countries. All countries move to a negative list, so it's much easier for the businesses to understand. Now, having said this, I would also say that it is time that if you want the private sector, if you want the business sector to take full advantage of the RCEP, I think the ASEAN Secretariat or the individual member countries need to look at providing information booklet, simplifying all these technical jargons into what the business, into a layman's language, so the businesses can easily understand. What a negative list or what a positive list. How do you read a negative list? How do you read an horizontal commitment and against the individual market access commitment, or how do you read a positive list? So all these, I would think, it's time for individual member countries or the Secretariat to have a very simple booklet that provides information to the business. For example, explaining in simple language what are the sectors that are being liberalized. For example, you can choose to give a few examples for each country, and in that way, the businesses might be more familiar and they can take advantage. But right now, over the last 2 hours, I've been listening. It's not easy to understand the Annex on telecommunication or the Annex on financial services. It's really technical, but if you can simplify those provisions in those agreements or the annexes into something much more simple, I think that will go a long way to get our businesses in the ASEAN or in the 15 member countries to take full advantage. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This is just, I'm not promoting this. This is the company I work for. We deal with public affairs, government relations, regulatory. So with that, Lan, I hand over the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ravi. I think you already answered my big question about the differences between this chapter, this agreement, with the previous FTA, the ASEAN have been pursuing, under the bilateral ASEAN plus external partners, and also within ASEAN. That is really significant thing. The second thing, I also echo what you try to convince the ASEAN Secretariat or whoever will follow up the implementation of the agreement, that we need to provide the business community with something that is practical material for the business to follow, to understand, and to really benefit from this agreement. I do hope that upon the entry into force of this agreement, then we should have the Secretariat of the RCEP, which is really a good vehicle to provide facility for the business community. I truly appreciate that idea, and I hope that some of my colleagues sitting around this screen should take note of this important point. Now, my last speaker is another former RCEP negotiator. So, Marisa, I want to introduce you for your last presentation. Thank you very much. And in the meanwhile, if you have any question from the audience, please bring up to us by writing it in the chat box, and I'm as a moderator will facilitate the discussion. So can I invite Marisa? Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Pat Lan. So I thought that this panel was supposed to discuss the presentations that were already done. So throughout the presentations, I have actually been taking notes and actually talking about comments on the kind of the presentations that has been done and how it can actually benefit businesses. So if you don't mind, Pat Lan, I am actually gonna sort of like share my thoughts about the different presentations that has been provided, that we have all listened to for the past 3 hours. I'm also very cognizant of the time, that it is almost 6 o'clock in KL, therefore 5 o'clock in Jakarta. So I will try and make it as succinct as possible. Okay, I think, so one of the things that we need to understand that the RCEP is intended to help businesses and also help, there's a balance in the RCEP. There's a balance between what businesses need and what policymakers, what the governments need to ensure that they retain the proper policy space to regulate, to ensure that the stability of the economy of a country. So I think that is something that everybody needs to keep in mind when they read any kind of FTA. So since we're talking about the RCEP specifically here, I'll just focus on the RCEP. So FTAs like the RCEP, the intention is to open the doors for businesses. So you open doors for businesses to enter into other countries, into our partner countries. And then what the negotiators have done is to place a denominator, a safety net for service providers, for traders, for investors when they want to trade with our preferential trade partners. So in this case will be our 15 RCEP countries. So the safety nets that I'm talking about are things like the dispute settlement measures, the transparency requirements, the exception requirements. These are all in Chapter 17, which is the general exceptions chapter. So you can see how this is where the governments have retained their policy space to ensure that, yes, we welcome businesses, we welcome investors to come and do business, let's globalize, but the governments have a responsibility to the participants of the economy to ensure that it is stable for them to do business in a safe manner. So that in case, so our safety nets, the FTAs, like the RCEP acts as a safety net in case anything undesirable happens in the ordinary course of business. So with the RCEP, I think in the first two webinars, we were talking about the overview of the RCEP, and then we also talked about how goods, how you can access the goods and how you can use the rules of origin chapter to facilitate trading in goods. And in trade and services, where we're talking about now, trade and services and the M&P chapter, we're talking about how the services suppliers will be able to benefit from the RCEP. I would also take it a step further to also say that this chapter really links a lot. I think Hazim very clearly mentioned this, that this chapter really links a lot to chapters like investments. And I will also go a step further to say that it also links in a way to the e-commerce chapter and the SME chapter as well. And I will explain a bit further in my next few points. So it's because when I think about it, when we talk about goods, there's also a spillover effects for the services that we provide to facilitate that trade in goods. So this is where the services chapter can also in addition to what Glenda has also said just now, like the different services that we provide, like construction services, transport services, and all of that. That all of these services sector in my head, to try and make sense of it, it links to trade. It links to supporting trade routes. Because of that, that's why services chapters and the services chapters in our FTAs are very important, because you can't be just trading goods without providing for access and providing for preferential treatment for the support services that goes with it. So I like to then maybe go into the next part of now, if we can just focus back into the trade and services chapter, particularly the annexes. I would like to make a comment because I thought Glenda's presentation on how to read the NCMs and how to read the SOCs were very informative. I would also like to add on to that to maybe put an observation that the trade and services chapter has specific annexes on financial services, telco, and professional services, because these three areas, I would call them catalyst sectors. I like to look at them as catalyst sectors because the financial services and telco communications, particularly in this time and exacerbated by the pandemic, that we're now falling back onto a, I wouldn't say fall back, I suppose we're moving forward into digitalizing our economy. So in that's where I think when we talk about digitalizing our economy, that's where the telco sector or the telco sector will be able to really support and strengthen the foundation for telco to support the provision of digitalizing the economy. Now, the next step to that, so that's our telco sector. When we link to that, now it opens up the businesses and the support these annexes give to three ways. One is the financial services suppliers themselves. Second, it would be businesses and individuals. And then third would be for government planning. So when we talk about financial service suppliers, this is where if you have a really strong telco sector, then you financial services suppliers would then be able to digitalize, modernize, and perhaps push the boxes within fintech boxes, like fintech provisions, to the next level. So when you, so then I remember just now, Hazim was also explaining about the new financial services provision in the Annex on Financial Services. This is new in the RCEP agreement. The provision of new financial services is so important for businesses, particularly in a region like the RCEP, where our economic development is at varying levels. So you have countries, very mature countries, economically mature countries that may have a lot of capital that they can export, that maybe they are looking for places to invest in. Maybe they're looking for, and that can be done within the that can be done within the RCEP economies. Now, how can we facilitate that? We see now there are a lot of fintech developments. We see a lot of people coming up with platforms to invest in P2P platforms, payment apps, payment programs. So these are things that facilitate the movement of goods. They facilitate the provision of services. So I would like to I would like to highlight that, you know, the provision of financials. So this, sorry, my apologies. Hazim's highlight of how new financial services is beneficial for the RCEP, it's because any kind of new financial services from another country, from another RCEP country, to provide that service into well, host country and the receiving country. That is really important because it gets people to innovate, and because of that, you are able to this new financial services obligation actually creates a regulatory tailwind for fintech players. So both in providing the financial service or even the development of other types of services related to that, for example, RegTech or regulatory technology. This is to manage the regulatory concerns that businesses might have when you want to answer questions about the FTA or even financial services regulations within that country. So another thing that the Financial Services Annex really highlights is the commitment to allow cross-border transfer of information in the course of ordinary business. This sharing of information, allowing information to cross borders, it may actually facilitate trade and reduce the cost of payments, because you can actually consolidate certain types of services within a particular country, therefore reducing the cost of actually doing business. So I think that the main thing I'm trying to say is that the more intertwined or the more better connected our regulatory landscape, it can actually help make business considerations less bumpy for the 2.2 billion population within this region. And if I may, Pak Lan, I would also like to say that the trade and services chapter also provides for, also helps with the development of the SME growth agenda. Most of the businesses within the region are SMEs. If 90%, if I recall reading that number in one of the reports. And this is where innovation, particularly new financial services, it can actually help narrow or even completely fill the financing gap. So we're talking about using a financial service to get investments from another RCEP country. So this can actually be facilitated via the Annex on Financial Services in the Trade and Services chapter. So again, the reason how this would be able to the reason to facilitate this is because the economic topography of the RCEP parties are quite varied, and because of the mix of the high income and lower middle income countries, it indicates a promising landscape for funding and investments. And the suppliers, the service suppliers, will be able to facilitate that. And I mentioned earlier, there's an SME chapter in the RCEP agreement, but currently it is largely focused on information sharing. But there is an obligation in that chapter for parties, i.e. the governments, to cooperate to build up SMEs' capabilities to access the benefits of the RCEP agreement. So this is one of the ways where, you can't read the RCEP chapter by chapter. It is linked from one chapter to another. I mean, I've already mentioned how Wadrina and Nita earlier also spoke about the telco chapter, and again, this is where the obligation can and must be read as a whole, because fintech providers will be dependent on the internet economy. Okay, I think the next point that I'd like to make is that, so that's on the part of the businesses. On the part of the government sector, part of the public sector, is that governments need to also retain some form of policy space to regulate. So, and this, that's why we have market access commitments. So you can see which areas a particular country is ready to open up more compared to other sectors, because there might be some form of specific, I wouldn't say interest, but specific concern that they may need to really look into that particular sector, or really manage the development and growth and liberalization of that particular sector. If I can then again use the Financial Services Annex as an example, the Article 4 of the Financial Services Annex, which is the prudential measures, is quite clear. The financial services sector must be regulated to ensure the stability of the financial sector. So that's why prudential measures, any financial regulator does to maintain the stability of the economy, to maintain the stability of the financial sector, as a prudential measure, it overrides a lot of the other provisions of the agreement. And this is because, again, it ties back to my earlier point, where it's because the financial services sector, I think it's a catalyst sector. So you need to ensure that the catalyst is stable so that everyone else riding that wave would be able to ride it, kind of less bumpy when they want to expand. So in conclusion, again, I'm very cognizant of the time. In conclusion, I think that moving forward, we can actually look forward to regulatory updates and changes that are in line with the RCEP agreement from all of the RCEP parties, if they're not already in place. So even when new regulations are implemented, these regulations will be done with the RCEP commitments in mind. And if I can just highlight that when countries develop regulations, they're not going to develop regulations based on the RCEP. They're not going to develop regulations based on the UNSPTA. They will develop regulations based on what is the need of that sector, what is the need of the economy at that point in time, and this will be applied across the board. The differences in the FTAs is whether you want to commit that, whether you want to promise that into the FTA or not, because the application is going to be the same. And for businesses to take advantage, in addition to everything Datuk Rabia said, which was very comprehensive, by the way, businesses can also start investing in research and also the necessary infrastructure to really take advantage of the RCEP agreement. Our panelists, our presenters have explained how to read the agreement. So you can see, for example, if you're in the construction sector, then you'll be able to see how the equity participation is like. Then from there, you can then set up the necessary infrastructure or set up the necessary groups that you need to ensure that you can access and use the RCEP agreement to your advantage. So that's where you will need to speak to your consultants, and actually investing in that research particular to your business and how it can really affect and take your business to the next level within the region. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much, Fatlan. I'm happy to take questions, and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marisa. I think I very much appreciate the way you try to articulate the idea of the previous speakers and also the panelists in a very structured way of how we should digest and how we should understand the service chapter, in a comprehensive manner. The service is actually a part of the whole economy, and more importantly, that the operationalization of the service chapter actually is enabling factors to unleash the new potential for the economy to grow, especially in the context of digital transformation. I really like the idea that really telecommunication, financial sector actually are the enabling infrastructure to allow the many other sectors in the economy to grow. I also appreciate the way you try to articulate how business should do and how the government should do better in regulating the sector, so the service sector. So I know that time is running out, so I'm sure that many questions that you may I think you may have in mind already been addressed by either by speakers or by our panelists. So having said that, I just want to share the last view with that. the organizers should circulate the presentation, from both the speakers and the panelists, and also try to relay the video on YouTube so that the audience can have more time to digest the information, so that we can generate more and more questionnaires, in the coming time. And I also emphasize the need that the secretariat, either ASEAN secretariat or the RCEP secretariat, need to develop a more practical material to explain, the nature and the interpretation of this agreement for the business sector. And for some of them, that is really critical. But they may not be necessary to learn everything. They may focus on the areas of interest that the business, they always be very practical than the official. So that I hope that by having this way, we can have a good, constructive, section like this one. It's just the starting point. So I again taking this opportunity, I would like to thank all the previous speaker, Waldrina, Nita, Glenda, Marisha. I also want to thank the panelists, Dino, Ravi, and Marisa. So thank you again. I would like to give the floor back to our organizers. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lan, for moderating the session. And I also like to thank again the speaker and the presenter for your very insightful presentation and discussions. So this webinar is coming to an end. Thank you all for joining us today. We greatly appreciate your participation. So I would like to announce that we are now preparing for the next webinar in the coming days. So the topics, detail, and schedule will be disseminated soon. And in addition to that, we will be sending you a short survey to get your feedback on today's webinar. We'll be grateful if you could answer so that we can reflect your view and opinion on the next coming webinar. And if you want to rewatch today's webinar, it will be again available in ASEAN Secretariat YouTube channel. And we are looking forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. Please keep safe and stay healthy. Thank you very much all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Fendi. Bye, everyone. Take care. Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.